Hi everyone. So sorry I didn't make a video last week. Things got a little hectic. But it seems like everyone was doing fine with the discussion boards and you guys were doing really well as far as I can tell with the review tests, with the readings about the political sociology basics. And so next week we're transitioning now into thinking about the state and civil society. So the two things are very separate, but they interact, right? So the state, as you'll see, is usually defined the way Max Weber defines it, as the organization that maintains a monopoly over the means of violence in a territory. So we're talking here not really about government necessarily, we're talking about this more abstract thing called the state, right? So different countries will have a state that can endure lots of different regime changes or different governments and still remain the state. So the question is, how does that get made? As you'll see, the videos deal particularly with this thing called social contract theory or contractarianism. And so if you can imagine the idea of going back into the deepest parts of history and seeing how at the very beginning people came together and had to figure out who's in charge. And that is the first origins of what we think of as the state. So you read Hobbes's idea of Leviathan, his famous quote that in the state of nature, life is nasty, brutish, and short. He comes to accept this idea that we make a contract, we agree to give up a lot of our own personal freedoms. We can't do whatever we want, whenever we want, in order to prevent that we will be oppressed by the biggest bully on the block. So that's essentially the social contract in a nutshell. You're also going to read Carol Pateman, who looks at the idea of the social contract and how, when we think about it in the way that Hobbes and others think about it, we think about it primarily through a male lens and ignore an important component of the social contract, which is the agreement, if you will, or subjugation, perhaps is the way she would phrase it, of women relative to men, which she calls the sexual contract. So all of that gets at this idea of the state. Weber's definition of the state is a classic one, and it's been used consistently now for almost a century by political scientists, sociologists, economists. Pretty much anyone in the social sciences will use some version of Weber's definition. Charles Tilly, who you're going to read, takes that definition and kind of runs with it in a really interesting analogy. And for him, the question is, if the state is an organization that maintains a monopoly of power or violence in a particular territory, how is it different from the mafia or your basic street gang? In other words, how is the state, how are the police, right? What makes the police different than, say, the Crips or the Bloods or the Mafia Kings, which is a gang from where I grew up? They're just people with uniforms who have weapons and try to enforce the will of somebody who's in charge, whether it's the Godfather or the mayor. And he kind of plays with this analogy in a very nuanced and interesting way that gets us to really think also about the origin of states. So a lot of political sociologists are not so much interested in the social contract, which is further down in history, but are instead a little more interested in the origin of states. How did states first emerge, especially modern states, right? How does a king become a king? How did dukes become dukes? How did those people eventually come to power? How did they create the bureaucracy that was the state? And for people like Charles Tilly, making a state is basically a form of warfare. So the states that are able to win wars survive. So you have France, you have Germany, and the states that do not are simply gobbled up. There's no more Republic of Venice, there's no more Grand Duchy of Milan, there's no more, all those little principalities in what used to be Germany got gobbled up by the Prussian Empire, which became the German Empire. So violence, for Charles Tilly, is at the heart of states. Now, that gets at the question of, why doesn't that terrify us? Perhaps for some people, especially certain kinds of Second Amendment proponents, it does, and maybe that's why they want to stockpile lots of weapons, hoping to be able to defeat a much better armed, much more sophisticated state. The other avenue, instead, is to think about civil society and what has happened to states over the last several centuries as they transformed from authoritarian states with kings and kaisers and czars and emperors to states that are run democratically, to states in which citizens exercise power and therefore have a way to restrain power. We see this, for example, in the US Constitution, one of the first modern states that deliberately set out to limit the power of the executive by taking away the ability to raise money and giving that to Congress, by making limitations on how war can be declared, by doing a number of things to try to rein in some of that power so that when violence is used by the state, we tend to agree with it. We don't argue that the police aren't allowed to pick somebody up off the street, put them in the back of their car, drive them through to a secure location and lock them up for weeks, months, years at a time. If anyone else did that, we would call that kidnapping. But when the state does it through legal and legitimate means that we recognize as legal and legitimate, then it is simply the police doing its work. And that's where civil society comes in. So some of the other readings you're going to look at are going to think about what important role civil society and other elements have that affect the state. So Linz and Stepan, who you're going to read in a classic from political science, especially about transitions to democracy, they're thinking primarily about Latin America and Eastern Europe in the early 80s. But it applies to any country, including our own. And they talk about the 5 arenas of democracy. One of them is civil society. They also talk about economic society, the marketplace. They talk about political society, our political party system, and everything that goes around with it. They think also about bureaucracy as an important component. And so how we think about the things that balance out a state are really important. Now we're diving into the deep end of political sociology. We've put the basics behind us. We have some concept of some key terms, stratification. We have a little bit of understanding, I hope, about the economy, which is an important component of how power is distributed, exercised, demonstrated, etc. And now, over the next few weeks, we're going to actually be going into some pretty complex ideas that come from political sociology. So I'm looking forward to hearing your comments and seeing your discussions online as we think about what is the state and how can civil society work within that state. What are the roles of it, and what are the important contributions and challenges that civil society faces when it interacts with the state. Okay? Thank you.